Thanks, Google. I appreciate it. So for today, we're going to continue with our curriculum. And if you need anything, please just message me or send me an email. You have my email, and then we can sort of carry on from there. But for today, we're going to be continuing from page 129. We're going to be looking at show preparation and how we go about the process of preparing for a show. So it all begins on page 129. And this is a really important element in the radio making process. The reason we are so obsessed as radio people with the idea of preparing for a show is because to plan content for 3 hours or 4 hours or 2 hours every single day of the week is quite a daunting process. If you think of it, to try and prepare for that often, to make content that often, it can be quite a tricky process because there is always something more to be done. Perhaps you put off something amazing, a life-changing, earth-shattering piece of content that you think is perfect. You know, you do it, and the next day you've got to do it again, basically. And we know the series of one, which prioritizes a sort of legendary moment once a year, but we know that as radio people, there is always more work to be done in terms of show preparation. So this is a good chance for us to reflect on how show prep works and what you need to do to make sure that you're preparing for a show in the best way possible. And begin here on page 129. So our textbook quotes Lane, who focuses on 4 key ideas in preparing for a show. Number 1, plan 4 segments beforehand. Number 2, hold weekly brainstorming meetings. Number 3, plan to insert the character and personalities into everything you prepare. And number 4, build links with the P2 in mind. Let's break those ideas down. So the idea of planning for a segment requires us to think about how the show clock appears and when we are going to be presenting this piece of content, this segment, this feature, whatever it might be. And there's a fantastic show plan sheet that gives us some ideas on how best to do this from page 130 in your Next Level Radio textbook. It's a fascinating document. And in it, we have a couple of key points that'll help us prepare our content in the most efficient way possible. First up, the idea of the hook. And bear in mind, I'm a professional broadcaster, and I have found that reanalyzing content moments from the perspective of wanting to achieve a good hook has completely changed my radio in the last couple of weeks since we've been studying this. So it really does work. How do you prepare your hook really well? It's a key element. How do you catch someone's attention? We've spoken extensively about a hook and how best to execute one, and there are a couple of guides. We're going to put a video online on that, but also in your textbook you can sort of have a look at some of the more elements of creating a great hook, which you can essentially start looking at from page 121. But the idea is you want to make sure you set up a piece of content in a way that pricks the listener's attention. Think about a radio consumer. For the most part, radio consumers are doing something else most of the time. They are passively listening, so they're busy cooking dinner, or they are perhaps busy driving, or maybe they are just sort of like doing something in the house. Most times people are listening quite passively. So if you want to grab their attention, your hook has to be quite strong. Whether it's a strong statement or a rhetorical question or whatever it might be, there are many creative ways to deploy a good hook to grab someone's attention. So outline that first and foremost. How am I going to hook the listener in? I had one this morning that I really enjoyed that I thought about when using this link planning sheet, where I found that I was still without water after 3 weeks, and I wanted to do a content piece about it, but I used the phrase, I think I might be smelling a bit gross this morning since I haven't bathed in 3 weeks on air. Within 7 seconds, every listener's like, ooh, gross, and therefore they're willing to tune in and get a sense of what I'm talking about. So that's the kind of example of how one plans for a hook. Then think about the payoff. What's the intention of the hook? What are you of the link rather? What are you trying to achieve in that moment? By focusing on how the link is intended to appeal to the listener, suddenly we have reason and justification for doing something, and it becomes quite clear what we're trying to do. I recall starting radio and really struggling with the idea of getting what was in my brain out of my mouth and into the microphone. I'd had these ideas, but there would sometimes be a disconnect between what I was sort of envisaging in my head and then delivering on air. And it's a really useful thing to actually be able to sit down and to be able to plan how this link is intended to be received by the listener. And if any of this is unclear, please just let me know. I've got my chat open, and I would love to hear any thoughts you might have on this particular thing. But the idea is that we want to make sure that when we are thinking about creating a good link, we're thinking about what the payoff is. What's in it for the listener? What are they going to glean from what we are doing? If I'm doing a great content piece on the fact that the fifth wave is starting, which is currently news in South Africa, that is the intention, to inform people that there is a fifth wave of COVID-19 around the corner, and that it's best to become more concerned with how you sort of behavior in public, wearing masks again, avoiding big crowds, potentially vaccinating if that's something that is in people's realm of interest. So that's the payoff, that's the intention. And once that's clear to me, I can then almost imagine it as a driving route. This is the end point, this is what I want to get to. Now I can focus on the directions to get to this point. So think about that payoff. What do we want people to feel? Because remember, radio is all about evoking discernible, clear feelings from people, be it humor, be it curiosity, be it anger, be it sadness, whatever it is. It's all about making sure people feel something at the end of the day. Then think about a point of view. What is your perspective of this? And if not your perspective, perhaps a perspective about a guest. A great story of how sometimes the presenter need not give their own perspective. I'm going to refer to David O'Sullivan right now. David O'Sullivan, for a couple of years, hosted the Kaya FM breakfast show. It was a great show, and David was really good at it. And what David did wonderfully one day, I heard him. And obviously, David is a white man of a certain age category, broadcasting to a predominantly traditionally black audience, right? So it's a complicated scenario, this. And the matter at hand was protest action. And instead of David giving his point of view, David resigned and said, I have no perspective on this because I'm a white man, and it would be wrong of me to tell my listeners how to feel about something. So he then produced a guest who could speak with authority on it. A black person with credentials who could then speak on the subject matter without favor, without fear, and their perspective was much more valuable in context when compared to David. And that's an example of our point of view isn't always about the presenter, but certainly there can be a perspective that the radio station provides in some way or another. So being aware of this is really important. And then thinking about what else, what's next, how can you make a piece bigger? A good example of this was Bongani Mtola on East Coast Radio a few years ago. He ran a content piece one time where he mentioned that he saw his brother, who he hadn't seen for 5 or 6 years before that, and his brother was working as a car guard. Now, Bongani was obviously a highly successful radio presenter at this point, so for him, seeing his brother playing the role of a car guard was surprising to him, and he spoke about it on air. And the next day, he began a story arc where he managed to actually reach out to his brother and explain what had gone on and sort of find out more about his brother's circumstance. And therefore, he was able to take the story and evolve it into a piece that ran for a couple of days and had a great podcast series afterwards, had video content. The meeting was filmed. There was a great emotional on-air moment for online usage as well. And so they asked the question, what else? What can be done to turn this into a larger content piece? And that's how they pursued that. And then the content piece went from being really strong to being legendary. That's the kind of thing that makes listeners just pop off and really enjoy what you're doing on air. So you can have a look-see at your link planning sheet on page 130. All these kind of points are summarized in this particular section right here. You can see that there's a summary, obviously explaining what you want to achieve in the shortest possible phrasing. The most clear phrasing is always an asset in radio. Radio is about being snappy, sharp, to the point, and very clear to a listener who doesn't have visual aids all the time to make sure that you are delivering content in the most efficient way possible. Emotivity, think about the emotion you want someone to feel. Think about what you hope your listener receives from this link. Is it going to be curiosity? Is it going to be shock? Is it going to be humor? Whatever it is, think about the emotion you are trying to evoke in your medium. Think about your promise. How are you going to tease this moment? If you are doing a content piece about the KZN floods, which is pertinent to us right now, think about how you're going to tease that creatively. Perhaps you're speaking to an authority on why you can no longer build at certain bits of land, or how long it might take for water to come back. You can then appeal to someone's emotions through a great hook. If you haven't bathed in the last 3 weeks, or if you're currently having to use river water, if you can't get to work and you are desperate to find out how much longer it's going to be until you can get to work, stay tuned for the next 10 minutes and we'll find out more. And therefore, you are using a great promise to make sure that your listener keeps listening a bit longer, which in aid assists your own station and your own show's RAMs numbers. Think about the hook, how you're going to draw the listener. We spoke about hook extensively. Think about your point of view, write that down, and then think about the payoff, how that link is going to end. We spoke about the term blackout previously. Where your end goal is, think about that, make sure to implement that in the best way possible, and then think about what else. How can we turn this single story into a potential story arc, and how can you make sure that it exists online as well? There's a couple of great ideas. And, you know, every single time we go on air, we can be using this method to help us make sense of how best to do our radio product. When you become experienced, I mean, if you look at someone like Anelia Doda, the odds are that she doesn't use this link planning sheet every time she goes on air because she's a 20-year veteran. She needn't write it down in technical ways, but you will hear these steps being thought through in her performances on air. Listen to the way she conducts herself on air, and you will notice these steps as part of her process. So it really does help in establishing ourselves as good presenters. On page 131, there's a second table that helps us distill this information, and we can then use this when we are live on air. Think about the type of link it is. This ties back to a section we covered quite extensively on page 105, the different types of links, different types of content pieces we can do. There's questions around that in this particular table on the link sheet. We've got promises, hooks, setups, and payoffs, which we've spoken about quite extensively. So there's a couple of cool documents we can make use of when on air to make sure our product remains competitive and remains really interesting for all of our listeners. From there, we can have a look-see at the next potential section of this section, and that is centered around the idea of holding a weekly planning meeting or a brainstorming meeting. Bear in mind, the key element of brainstorming in radio is to allow every idea to breathe a bit. Sometimes an idea might seem a bit farcical to begin with, but if you sort of pursue it and prod it and poke it around, let it live for a while in your brain, kind of work out the meaning behind it, you really can achieve massive success by running interesting on-air campaigns and sort of breaking the mold. And these probably all come from originally brainstorming sessions. So a good example of that right now is running on East Coast Radio, where they have a Last Kid Standing competition with Sasco. It's a big client campaign, which is great. But what happens is they have these grade 4s across the province busy spelling on the radio. It's a spelling bee, essentially. And it's fascinating listening, and it allows for listener participation, and essentially is a really good way to appeal to East Coast Radio's core audience. And this probably, I don't know this, but it was certainly something that probably occurred in a brainstorming meeting at one point. So brainstorming is a really important part of the radio making process. So it's probably a good idea to hold one every week with your whole team, and you can sort of eke out where you are looking to go. If you know that you've got a big content piece due as part of your series of one, the Tracy Johnson thought process that we've covered on page 105, then it might be time that you start thinking about how you can develop a great story arc that will exist as one of your sort of firework moments that makes your show legendary, something really, really memorable. How are you going to work that out? Well, have a chat during your brainstorming sessions, get a sense of where you are in your life, talk about what's affecting you right now, what's bothering you, what's making you feel good, whatever it might be. Talk about those things. Let each member of the team build on that and find out how you can turn these personal anecdotes or experiences or the general prevailing morality of society, what's going on in the news right now, how you can make great radio moments out of these content pieces that exist in your life, how you can sort of attack the issue and make it fleshed out, and you can really make some great radio by holding a really fantastic brainstorming meeting once in a while. There's also an idea on page 132 about radio prescription-based services. So essentially you sign up to a website, and every couple of days, every day perhaps, you get sent content. And this is obviously quite a help and feels like a bit of a cheat, but whatever it takes to make your show pop off in the best way possible, why not use it? You know, if it's there, make use of it. There's some great ones. RadioWarfare.com. That one is, I think if I recall correctly, it's backed by a radio consultant called Francis. forget his name now. He's a radio consultant, a British guy, who's one of the world's best radio consultants, and he has then overseen the process of radiowarfare.com, and it essentially sends you birthdays and interesting news articles, and it kind of is tailor-made for radio people. What stuff could work really well on air. Sometimes it offers suggestions about caller topics and how you can turn that caller topic into a larger story arc, which is fascinating. There's also fmjob.com, which essentially gives you ideas about gags and content pieces, and it really helps your creative process along the way. And many people might feel that this is a kind of cheat. You're paying someone else to do your prep for you, but why not become the best version of yourself that you can be by making use of these sort of things? One that I kind of relate to is every day before I go on air, I listen to the Global News podcast from BBC World Service. It's a free service and therefore I'm able to get a good sense of some of the more interesting news stories around the world. And it's quite up to date, and I'm certainly plugged into what's going on when I go on air. And from there, I can begin the process of filtering my content down and making it more appropriate for on-air use. And when you look at a service like this, it simply is the same process of accumulating news, but just distilling it by radio professionals for radio professionals. So it really is a kind of win-win service. You can try some of these if you're interested. Most of them are available for free. I know I signed up once to one of these things, and it probably wasn't tailor-made for South Africa, so I probably didn't rely on it too much. But perhaps if you sign up to one of these things, it really can help you benefit your show, and you can become a world champion broadcaster because you are having a lot of your content needs taken care of by a website. And then we can have a bit of a look at one of our next sections around the RIP formula. And this starts on page 136. And there is a very important note in this. And this is a caution as told by Next Level Radio about the process of simply regurgitating content on air. And it's something that I kind of implemented when I was at campus radio, some of my peers who were just joining up. And I said, don't do the job of a newspaper. If you are simply regurgitating, you are doing the job of a newspaper, and you therefore could be replaced by a written page, which is a mad thought to think about. As radio people, we have to lean into the skill of our industry, the benefit of our industry, and that is the capacity to make great on-air moments by taking a news topic, by taking something that's sort of happening around us, and we can make it unique and make it specific to ourselves and turn it into something epic on air. And to make sure that we are doing this, we are avoiding regurgitating things on air, the RIP formula is recommended. To make sure we are researched, so we are spending time listening to news, making sure we have internalized the content, that's the I, the RIP. The I is internalized, so taking some news or whatever and allowing it to sort of make sense to us individually. We can mull over it for a while, we can kind of get a sense of what this news means to us. And then to perform it, to make sure we are doing it on air in the most efficient and entertaining way possible. Here's an example of how I did a piece of content today, which you might like, that was centered around the RIP formula. There is news, again, that the COVID-19 fifth wave is set to begin in South Africa, but we understand now that perhaps the danger of new variants is not as pertinent as it was 2 years ago. Ultimately, at this point, if you do get COVID-19, you are much more likely to have an easier experience than if it were in April 2020, So we decided to look at this content piece and try and make it interesting to people. It's a common fact right now that people are tired of hearing about COVID-19. So how do I make this interesting? So I went on air and my hook was a very strong one. My hook was, I am about to annoy you. That's what I said when I was on air. And then I said, I'm going to ask you for 15 seconds of your time because I care about you and I want to warn you about something important, but I don't want to annoy you. So it's going to be time for 15 seconds. So I took the news, which was the fact that we are approaching the fifth wave. I internalized it. I took it on and I kind of made sense of where it was for me. And then it was time to perform. And I added a 10-second timer. And I said, for 10 seconds, I'm going to warn you, and then it's over. And so I took 10 seconds and I said, the COVID-19 fifth wave is about to begin. That's all indications say. Please make sure to take care of yourself and your family. Vaccinate, wear a mask, avoid big crowds, and you'll be fine. And then I ended with the timer going, eh. And from this, I had a great on-air moment that was interesting and unique and had a different perspective than usual. a starting point, an end point, and the performance was flawless. So throughout this, I managed to use that RIP formula. I focused on researching the news, making sure it's factual, internalizing it, spending a couple of hours thinking about how I'm going to approach it on air, and the performance then was unique and interesting and quite strong as a result of spending time working on this RIP formula as advocated by Dick Stone on page 136 of our textbook. There is a guide that's offered to sort of help us make questions, to question how best to deliver this content in intriguing ways. And that's to think about the kind of bed music that we are using. So if it's a sad story or whatever, get a really emotional bed. It turns a simple on-air performance into a great on-air moment. A sound effect, if something is shocking, there's no reason you can't add a record scratch. Sound. If something is ridiculous, maybe add the bed from the TV show Curb Your Enthusiasm. You'll know most about how effectively a strong bed or a sound effect can work when you think of TikToks. Many of the gags on TikTok is sort of built around the usage of a bed or a theme song about something. So it's that kind of thing that really can add texture to a link and bring a link to life. Think about who should be involved in the segment or the feature. If you've got a triple-header team, does one person need to be omitted? Who should lead it? What is each person's specific role in that moment? If you think that a question needs to be asked of your listeners to get things going, a great example of that was the example that we played in class recently of a different kind of hook that's used. And the presenter asks his team, what do you fear more than anything else besides dying? The question was asked, it was rhetorical, but it got people thinking before he managed to introduce his whole content piece. So it was a disguised hook, but it relied on a question to get things going. If you need a caller, so if you want someone to respond, perhaps, your question is, how do you bath without water? What's the solution? Getting a good caller in can really add a lot of dimension to that content piece. And maybe you can focus on an audience quiz or a mock news bulletin, whatever the case is. Mock news bulletins have kind of fallen out of favor in modern broadcasting standards. I know that a very famous breakfast show called Dave Berry on Absolute Radio, they have a Friday fake news bulletin. I'm not sure it works anymore, but perhaps one day someone will come around and they'll be able to produce a really good piece of mockumentary type news. Someone on Fiverr did it as well recently, which was kind of cringe to hear. It wasn't great. But nevertheless, there is still room to play in the realm of sketches on air. A couple of other techniques to sort of bring content to life from your own life, which is brilliant. If you can get your own life into your content, right, it's super special. So Johnson, who is a really important source in this textbook, advises that people want to sort of create context and drama by contrasting different perspectives. So someone who does that to the T is Bongani Mtolo on Radio 2000. His breakfast show essentially allows for a listener to call in, share their perspective, and if that perspective is challenged by someone else, he will bring that person to air and they can have both perspectives presented, and that's basically his whole methodology to radio. Contrasting views, and to hear that as a listener is always going to be a fascinating experience. So to present contrasting views is brilliant. Even on a campus radio show I listened to a little while ago, they had, on a science show, they had two different viewpoints on the same thing presented. So it was about lie detectors. One person said lie detectors are hugely efficient. The next person said they're a lot of nonsense. And it was great to listen to because they got a broad range of perspectives. Perhaps, you might want to say, okay, how valid is a chiropractor? Get a chiropractor, get a critic, and that sort of juxtaposition is fascinating for radio. You can exaggerate it by addressing that conflict. It's a great way to hook someone in. X person says this, Y person contradicts it. Let's find out more. What a fascinating hook. To essentially allow your content to live on, to resolve conflict is brilliant. Perhaps you might have a loved one who's in a feud with someone else in your family. If you can bring a sort of solution via an on-air link, you are in the Q zone for fantastic radio content. Seek the Extreme is a piece of content advice that's offered, which is really interesting because it is the kind of thing that makes people listen out, is extreme versions of things. That's why a show like Survivor is in its 40th season in America, because basically you're taking people and putting them into the most extreme possible context, deprived of food, nutrition, sanitation on an island. Watching that take place is fascinating. So if you can sort of lean into the extreme on radio, you are again in a Q zone. Perhaps you're doing a piece of content on a family feud, but if you can bring in people who are in a 20-year family feud over a spoiled yogurt, something really ridiculous like that, man, it's primitive and it's fascinating. It appeals to people's primal needs for drama, and it works super well as an on-air content piece. There's an idea about creating top 10 lists, and lists are obviously really popular on blogs and stuff like that. In radio, do they work? If they are personalized enough, they do. It's a really good thing to do if you can personalize it. Make it super hyper-local or very particular or quite random. As long as it's specific to you and interesting and worth listening to, it works. And if you can find a way to make people feel like it's a game, get them to play along, it works really well. So a short while ago, I found a very early recording of Dua Lipa in her bedroom before she became famous. She was like 14. And I had the audio. And I then went searching for some people who were famous before they were famous doing live performances. And I was then able to use that on air in a kind of game. I played it out loud and I said, who is this person? And people were able to guess in. And it really kept the show moving forward in a great way. And I had some really positive feedback about it because I took the content piece and I made it sort of live in a really interesting way on an online and on-air capacity. Adding a guest always works really well, especially in talk radio. We know that to speak about something, if you have a guest with a valid viewpoint, it really does add a whole lot to a content moment. Recently I happened to see terrapin in the Durban Botanic Gardens in the river there, the pond, and I was like, why the hell is there terrapin here? How did this happen? So I contacted the gardens to find out, and they were able to explain to me that this is actually from the 1980s when the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were a thing, and people began to buy terrapins, then realized they didn't really like them, and they put them into the pond there, and now there are terrapins in the lake at the Durban Botanic Gardens. Not earth-shattering content, but certainly hearing the perspective of the man who runs the gardens is fascinating, and it's a great sort of content piece because it makes sense to those who've been there before, and the odds are that if you're a Durbanite, you have been there before. So it's really specific and works really well. Adding personalized content pieces is really, really important as long as people have context. So if you are resetting well and explaining things that make sense, take the story arc of someone having a baby, represent having a baby on air, be it a man or a woman or whatever the case might be. It works really well as an on-air experience if you are able to bring in personal anecdotal experience from presenters who are on air and doing a particular thing at a particular time. And then to create unique, original content that is specific to you. It's really important for us as radio people to constantly attempt to make content that is unique and specific. You can beat the best jocks on slots that are alongside you if you are able to make people care about your personal experiences. That authentic personal reflection is really, really powerful. If you are graduating, making content about your graduation can be really impactful and people care. I'm using this example because I just graduated from varsity and I made radio about it. And because yesterday was a public holiday, I didn't get to sort of complete the story arc about my graduation for many of my listeners. They weren't listening, they were sleeping in. And I had about 40 messages from people saying, listen, what happened with your graduation? It was crazy to me that people eventually, once your show is in this mature phase, they really care about that sort of thing. So when you have these sort of tools in your brain, you can then begin to double down. You can begin to think about how to make sure you are inserting each character and personality into a particular link. This is on page 138. So how you can make sure that each character on the show has got a character map that aligns with that person's character traits. So if you have someone who's a massive sports fan on your show, then they're the person who will take lead on sport-related content. When sort of the whole country spoke about the Rugby World Cup, if you have a sports person on the team, leading into that's really, really powerful. If you have a music expert, letting them talk about new music is a powerful thing because it sort of leans into the personality that they are. So you have someone who's an expert on political matters. When there's a political fight, get them on your show and get them to speak up about it because they are essentially the one that matters in that context. So if you can sort of help someone by building what they enjoy into their personality and character moment links, you can make an even more impactful radio product. There's a suggestion to own the music information, which is really, really fascinating. And if you want to sort of personalize it, it's a really powerful tool. Instead of saying, Lady Gaga releases a new song on 3rd of May this year, why not think about personalizing to someone's personal music taste? Think about the fact that Lady Gaga's been an actor in recent years. She's been quiet musically. She's kind of shed the pop identity with an album called Jolene. And then she came back to the pop identity in Chromatica. And now she's coming back for a soundtrack of the Top Gun movie. So think about those career shifts, and then maybe you want to ask the question, how many times have you thought about changing your career profession? If you weren't doing what you're doing right now, what would you be doing? Ask that person that question, make it specific to them, and then be like, because Lady Gaga is back to making music, but this time it's for movies, so it's a bit of a confluence between film and music, and you might be able to spice up the link by personalizing it in that sort of way. It's a really useful tool to do. There's an example of Sarah Taylor in America who is able to personalize a news report. And there's a description of that on page 139. But this is something that I've had to learn myself. You know, I when I got my show on Eat Breakfast, I didn't want to do weather. I was like, who does weather? It's 2021, you know, like people don't eat weather anymore. It's 2020 at the time. So I stopped doing the weather. And people went ballistic. They went mad. They were like sending me death threats. Not quite, but I was getting like threatened by people and they were complaining and like, oh, where's the weather? And eventually I realized it's because people enjoyed that personal touch. They could look at their phone, they could look outside the window, but to make it personal is fantastic. So for me, when I do the weather now, I think to myself, okay, is it a day to do the washing? If yes, tell them that. If not, then tell them that. Is it something to be worried about? When the floods happened recently, doing the weather was a bit of a strange thing because how do you forewarn someone about the kind of weather we were having? So when it wasn't going to be raining, I said, no need to fear because today there's not set to be rain, which is a good relief because maybe we can get some progress going on recovering our province. That sort of thing is personal and really, really enjoyable for listeners. So by personalizing your content, it makes the show shine. Think about good traffic reports. You know, if you consider the fact that right now to get to Verulam from the M4 is taking people about an hour a day, maybe be like, if you are going home to Verulam tonight, it might be a good idea to delay your trip and have some dinner at work because you're going to be late. There's no use sitting in your car. That sort of personal touch helps content really pop off. Shaking hands with the listeners. It's a really important thing to sort of allow your listener to become part of your show, a contributor. You know, sometimes you hear roll calls on the radio and it's very rudimentary, but people like hearing the name on the radio. So solicit for that. Ask folks to tell you where they are in the morning and say their name on air. It essentially helps them make them feel that that show is their own. And hopefully in the future, if I hear 15 people in the morning contributing to your show, it might make me more compelled to contribute in the future. And that community is then stimulated. It's massaged. It begins to make sense in the grand scheme of things. So by allowing us the capacity to make it feel like everyone is listening to the station, it creates a sense of exclusivity and ownership, and it keeps folks coming back for longer. A little while ago, I was listening to Carl Kassim on 5FM on a Saturday night, and I've been on air then, so I know it's not a great time for sponsors and stuff like that. And I could hear that he was perhaps struggling a bit for, you know, people to sort of send in voice notes on his show. But I know that listeners don't, and it sounded full enough for me to decide, okay, I want to take part in the show. And after he had a first round of people saying the name on his show, it suddenly led to a massive resurgence of participants getting onto the show and being like, hey, Carl, I like your show, whatever. That sort of shaking of the hand of the listener is such a powerful tool. Once you have the listener's sort of recommendation that you're doing a good job, man, you are golden. Someone else who does that really well is Greg James on Radio 1. Listen to that show. It's available on the internet freely. He always has listeners contributing to the show, even if he just reads their name. It just helps that community that supposedly exists as part of the radio show. So it's a really useful thing to think about shaking hands with your listeners. And that can also be done with sort of like the process of taking phone calls, getting a listener's voice on air, having a bit of a chit chat, a bit of a gander, that sort of thing makes the show really personable. And think about adding lifestyle comments. What are you doing at this time? Why are you awake so early? Are you gymming? Are you working out? Are you lying in? Whatever it might be. If people reflect their lifestyle, one, you get a sense of what kind of content works for them, and two, it helps people drop their guard and it incorporates your show into their lifestyle, because we know radio is essentially a medium that's built around people's lives. So if we can get them to take part in our show as a matter of a rule, it really does benefit the functioning of our radio show in the grand scheme of things. Once you've had a look at the lifestyle content, the next piece of advice given to us is to build links with a P2 listener in mind. Now, a P2 listener essentially is someone who doesn't listen to our station regularly. P1s listen every day, P2s listen sometimes, and P3s have never heard about you before. That's the general. So a P2 is someone who is essentially sampling your show. If their favorite station is talking for too long or playing a bad song, they might dip into your station, and then you can really allow them to love your product by being brilliant a lot of the time. And this is important to establish a connection with them because they've got very little context. So the key word is to reset, because if you come on air without any context and you talk about something that you've been talking about for the last 3 weeks, they will have no context and won't care about it. So to constantly re-explain things is an important part. We don't cater for P1s because P1s are rare and they are probably a bad habit for us to appeal to, because what happens is then we believe that everyone is listening to us all the time and we forget that it will become exclusionary. People won't be able to jump onto the on-ramp and drive along the highway. They want an opportunity to sort of get to know us, and if we are thinking about P2s, we make sure that everyone can sort of pick up and jump into the content we are producing. It makes it far more inclusive than if we simply isolate people by focusing on P1s too frequently. If I've had a baby in the last 6 months, this is a content piece idea, it's important to explain who the baby is. If I'm Fakile Mweti, who was on 5FM's lunch show back in the day, she references her child Malachi. If she speaks about Malachi and she's like, Malachi kept me up late last night because he wanted to feed the whole night. You might think, is that her boyfriend? Was her boyfriend keeping her up last night? Surely that's a private thing. But if it's her baby, suddenly it makes a lot more sense. So the ability to reset and make content for P2 listeners is a powerful tool as part of our radio arsenal. You can attract a listener who is potentially sampling your show by front-loading your link very creatively to essentially reset brilliantly, to make sure people are interested because you are hooking them really, really well. Why would they care about it? So you can make sure the production and the imaging of the show sort of speaks to the show's personality. Make sure you got strong, big imaging that sort of leans into your humor, leans into what you're trying to achieve, leans into your wholesomeness. So someone sampling potentially looks to stay a little bit longer. Make sure that you think about each character map, which is essentially the character's interests, traits on the show, and think about how you can make sure their content aligns with that so we get a better sense of who each person is more frequently. If you love gaming, do gaming content at moments so listeners who are P2s can start to get a better sense of who you are, that you're an expert, that you care about the sort of thing that you are covering on the show at that particular part. Providing context about what your emotional triggers are, what sort of makes you feel a certain kind of way, where you are in your life. By giving context on that, people are more likely to digest the kind of content you are presenting more often. And also by being relatable and endearing through being vulnerable. If you can relate to someone, they can relate to you because you are telling a story about how you are being bothered by the lack of water. It's a very powerful product, and the person is much more likely to sort of tune into you in future rather than someone else who's being super inauthentic. A good example of someone being very personable is DJ Ankletap on YFM. If you listen to his show, he's pretty frequently sharing personal details about his life. Recently, he went through a divorce. It's been a major theme on the show, which maybe is sometimes jarring to people, but certainly they do love his sincerity on air. Think about story arcs, how you can take a content piece from one day to the next, perhaps even over the course of a week, and how each content piece can grow as it sort of develops. A good example of a story arc was I once received a WhatsApp voice note from a listener called Kerwin. And Kerwin was in Baghdad during the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. He was a fireman there. And we documented his journey from Baghdad to Durban over the course of 8 days. Every day we heard a bit from Kerwin. Fascinating experience for me. Incredible as a radio moment. One of my favorite things of all the time. Teasing, thinking about how to make sure someone comes back to your show more often. Promising really well. If you are sort of doing a content moment with 5 minutes left of your show, instead of wastefully saying goodbye, say, hey, tune in at 7:10 tomorrow morning because this big thing's happening. The idea is that someone then sets an appointment and they'll come back and they'll listen. And then context is really important. Who are you? What day is it? What are we talking about? Give people all they need in the most simple way to take part in the fun of the show. That really is an important thing. Think about putting things into a running order, how each content piece in relation to the next needs to line up to make sure that there are things to be aware of every single day, every single hour, so you are the most efficient version of yourself on air. You are aware of how to make sure that things fit into a clock together. If you are doing 3 serious content pieces in a row, your show becomes way too serious for you. So perhaps it's then good to balance your clock a bit differently, think about how things can fit into each other. Perhaps one content piece might link to the next in some way or another. And that way your show keeps living and keeps breathing and essentially goes from strength to strength. And that is essentially a couple of key elements needed in the process of preparing content. If you have any questions about this, please email me, michael.fenter97@gmail.com. This essentially helps us distill week 11's content for Radio 2 into this conversation right now. And we can obviously chat more about this as we link up in class on week 12. But now you get a good sense of how best to make use of your preparation time and how best to capitalize on preparation techniques so that process of planning for a show is not quite as difficult as it initially seemed.